Now, okay. So the question before the camera started rolling for those watching at home was chapter 1. We had only one Mishnah left to go. But to make you come back, it's a cliffhanger. But there's another reason, which is as we read it, we're going to see there's content in chapter 1 that may seem very unfamiliar or surprising to some people. So I wanted to make sure we had time to really discuss it and for me to explain it, because it's describing a historical set of circumstances that most people are completely unaware of and will sound totally foreign to modern Jews. So with that in mind, chapter 1, Mishnah 11, I need a volunteer, and I think there's only one person whose hand is going to be up, or rather all the other hands are pointing at you.
Yes, sir. There is no difference between Shiloh and Jerusalem, except that in Shiloh, sacrifices of lesser sanctity and second type could be eaten anywhere within sight of the town, whereas in Jerusalem, they had to be eaten within the walls.
Okay, so first things first, what is Shiloh?
It's not a place.
It's a place, right? Shiloh, right?
Yes.
No, why is this important? Shiloh, I mean, Shiloh and Jerusalem are the same?
It was the place where Shmuel and Avi was there,
Okay.
and the first prophets were there.
But
The center of the...
that was just their address, or was there anything else there that was important?
The ark.
The Mishkan, right, with the ark and everything else in it, right? So Shiloh was the longest home for the Mishkan, for the tabernacle, of any of the places it moved when it was in Israel before it ended up in Jerusalem. The question here is, okay, so when the ark and the Mishkan was at Shiloh, and when the ark came to Jerusalem, was there any difference between the two cities? While Shiloh stood and when Jerusalem stood. Now, they were not both sanctified at the same time, right? These are two different points in history. But comparing them, what was the difference? So the first answer is, well, they were the same, except that for things that you were allowed to eat outside the precincts of the Mishkan, for Jerusalem, you still have to be within the walls of Jerusalem. But for Shiloh, you just had to be in view of the town because it didn't have walls. This wasn't a city. This wasn't something with walls all around it like Jerusalem, like a fortress or a protected city. So how do you figure out where the area is near the Mishkan? Jerusalem's easy. We have walls. For Shiloh, not so easy. But the answer is, if you can see it, you're close enough.
I thought it would be the same as the distance that you can walk on Shabbat far from your house.
So, you know,
make the same measure.
So that would be an answer, but it's not considered an answer of the formal, what's the term? Vicinity. That's the word I'm looking for, right? You have to eat it within the vicinity. And just like in English, the word vicinity is kind of slippery. It's not something that you can get out a yardstick and measure. They are also saying the vicinity of the Mishkan was if you could see the Mishkan. And indeed, that would be different in different locations. So you don't want to say it's 2,000 amot, but it's 3,000 feet, because 3,000 feet could put you into a forest, or 3,000 feet could put you into a valley, or put you over a hill. And now you're not in the official vicinity, even though the circle puts you close enough. So that's why they give a specific no mistake could be made definition, which is eyeballs on the place, you're still in the vicinity. So sometimes it might be further, and sometimes it'll be less. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And then part 2 is going to follow up sort of that idea.
In both places, the most holy sacrifices were eaten within the curtains.
Right, within the curtains means within the actual precincts of the temple or the Mishkan, as opposed to outside of that. So that was the same in both cases. Now, part 3 is the part that's going to seem really weird.
Of Shiloh, there is permission for altars, but after the sanctification of Jerusalem, there is no such permission.
Okay, so this is where we need a little timeline, if you'll bear with me.
And Bamot is altars.
Yes, Bamot is altars, right? Now, what do we mean when we say a Bamot, right? A Bama, or we say Bima now. What do we mean?
I mean a platform.
Now, that's what we mean. That's not what they meant. What they meant is, let's imagine you need to offer a sacrifice, right? It's a sin offering, it's a goodwill offering, the baby was born, whatever, you need to bring a sacrifice. Where do you go?
To go to Jerusalem. Or where the temple is.
So hold on, let's get our little timeline here. So this is when the Mishkan was in Shiloh, right? This is not drawn to scale. And I should point out, we have Jerusalem version 1 and version 2, right? And there's a gap in between of 70 years. Okay, so here's the question. I have a sacrifice to bring. And right now, I am living before Shiloh has been established. Now the Mishkan is put up, right? The Mishkan was in other places before Shiloh. And I have a sacrifice to bring. Where do I go?
So you go to the Kohen first.
Go to a Kohen, not necessarily the Kohen, right? Even though, just do that, the Ark / Mishkan / temple / altar, the main altar, existed for this whole time. Shiloh stood, this was the only place you could do it. When Jerusalem stood, this was the only place you could do it. Before Shiloh, anywhere. You could make an altar anywhere. You still had to sacrifice it according to halakha. You still had to follow Jewish law. You didn't just have to go out in the back and sacrifice, like a barbarian. But you didn't need to go to the Mishkan. You didn't have to schlep to wherever the Mishkan was. When Shiloh was erected, when the Mishkan was there and it was settled and safe, then no, you were not allowed to go and sacrifice in your backyard anymore. You had to sacrifice at Shiloh. Shiloh or nothing.
It's not hardship.
What's that?
It looks to me like a hardship.
Yes, but the Torah continually talks about the idea of God having a place where he makes his name known, and then that is the place where you have to go. The idea of it being the central place of worship is very important. But we already give a little extenuating circumstances before Shiloh. The question becomes, what happens after Shiloh is destroyed? After Shiloh is destroyed, any place is okay again. Right? Even though the Mishkan is rebuilt and reestablished in other places, or reset up rather in other places, like re-erected, I guess is the right word, you are still, again, in the period between Shiloh and Jerusalem becoming the seat of the Ark and the temple, you are allowed to worship wherever you are.
I don't remember when it was destroyed.
It was by the Philistines, if I remember correctly. I have to double check that. But it was overrun, and they had to move.
After Shaul was defeated? Or?
No, before that, I believe. I have to double check my full timeline. But if you get a good timeline of Jewish history, it'll say where all places the Mishkan was.
What did they have in Shiloh? The same.
The Mishkan was there with the Ark and the altar for a few hundred years. I mean, it was just there, static, and that allowed
the one
it.
That Moses built
Yes,
in the desert.
That one. Yes, yeah. It wasn't no copies.
No, yeah.
Different. Our Mishnah is pointing out is that once Jerusalem came into being, once we had the Temple of Jerusalem, when the Babylonians destroyed Temple number 1, we offer sacrifices.
Anyone?
No,
Now it's nowhere.
No.
Right? That's what this Mishnah is saying. After the sanctification of Shiloh, there was permission, meaning even though Shiloh had been sanctified, after it, once it was gone, there was still permission to offer sacrifices in other places. But after the sanctification of Jerusalem, there is no permission, meaning that once Jerusalem becomes it is it and only it forever.
So that's why we have no sacrifices.
That's why we have no sacrifices. And this is confusing because we are all very aware that we don't have sacrifices now, and we can't have sacrifices now. And I don't get to go offer a sacrifice, in Orlando, and I don't get to even go to Israel and offer a sacrifice in some other part of the country. It is Jerusalem or nothing. Trying to point out is that's different between when we had Shiloh, which was an all or nothing situation, and when Jerusalem attained the sanctity that endures in exclusion forever, which works out quite well, as we've been talking about Jerusalem a lot in the news lately.
Yes,
that
yes,
Jerusalem.
Yes.
in Congress.
Well, actually, Congress is supportive of the resolution, but it'd be nice if more people around the world at least acknowledged. I mean, I understand the diplomatic ramifications, etc., but we can pretty much see what it is.
And why the rabbis they pushed for the Jerusalem as a very important special status?
Yes.
So why did Jerusalem achieve this status is a much more complicated topic, right? So Jerusalem became the focus. It became the Bait, which was a fixed place, rather than the Mishkan, which was, no matter, even though it was at Shiloh for so long, the Mishkan was always meant to be moved. It was always meant to be impermanent. And they felt that when Jerusalem was founded, when it became stone rather than cloth, it formed into the place where my name will dwell. Phrase that's used over and over again, especially in the book of Devarim, that this is the place where I cause my name to dwell. And once it had reached that location, or that status as being the location of God's name, it can't be shifted. It was permanently attached forever to that place. Also very important for a second reason. If you had a different understanding, and this may sound a little more political, but it still should not be dismissed. When Jerusalem became, how long was it the center, the capital city of the Jews? Question. How long was it the capital city of all the Jews? How many generations? How much? Generations. Exactly. David and Solomon ruled over Jerusalem and all of the Israelites, right? Rehoboam, when he takes over, he is a terrible leader. He gets bad advice from his drinking buddies. I'm serious, right? That's not a joke. The nation is torn in half. And what happens to the north? They set up their own place of worship. They want their people coming to Jerusalem to worship because that makes them feel second best. Right? It's like the same way that when Henry VIII didn't like what the Pope said, because he didn't want his people going to a church that he disagreed with, he wanted them going to his church. And so he became the head, he became Pope of the Church of England. So what happens as well is that if you allowed this rule to continue, then they could have had their Bamot in the north of Israel, and that would have been perfectly fine, and we would have had a divided nation forever. The focus and center over and over and over, and the only place to be of all Jews for all time. So it really is a very powerful choice that was made, and one that we have now continued with for the last 2,000 plus years, 2,500 years or so. So, okay. And as you can see, this took a good 15 minutes, which is why I didn't tack it on to last week's class. All right, but now, chapter 2, Mishnah 1. Back to the Megillah.
Last 2 months ago, there was a big hoopla in Israel because the Knesset members went to Shiloh, found in there. It was like
an artifact or something?
A structure.
Oh, okay.
A structure that had all kinds of Jewish motifs on it. Found it, said this was what the Mishkan was.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I missed that announcement.
Yeah.
It was something.
I have to look through the news. I have to look through the news, yeah, because it's very, very hard to find definitive artifacts from the period of Shiloh, the period of the judges, because, well, it's a long time ago, and that period was not known for giant buildings, because it's the small buildings are the ones that disappear first. It's the big buildings that last much longer.
And very poor society. Very poor
society. As we see from throughout the book of Shoftim, it wasn't always a happy time. Success, failure, success, failure. Something that really is fascinating.
I found something. I trying to remember what exactly, but they found something.
Right. And the Mishkan itself, that would leave behind no footprint. You didn't have a huge stone foundation for the Mishkan. You just like a tent.
It was.
Literally a tent, exactly. So I'd be interested to see what they found. If you can find the link, great. If not, I'll hunt for it.
It was something like a synagogue or something that looks like a synagogue.
Synagogue would be questionable from the time of the Shoftim. The idea of a synagogue as an institution didn't exist then. It had been invented.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Right. I'll look it up. You look it up. We'll find out what the news was. To Mishnah 1, right? We're actually back to the holiday of Purim after like 8 other topics.
If one reads the Megillah out of order, he has not fulfilled his obligation.
All right. So if you read chapter 1, then chapter 8, then chapter 2, then chapter 6, that's a silly idea. I mean, anybody who's ever told a story about, and you might start off by saying, well, we left, and by the time we got back, let me tell you, we were so tired. Well, you just told me the end, and you're telling the story out of order, right? So telling a story in order is hard, and especially if you're telling a story to people and you want them to understand, to bring information from other parts of the story to fill in and help them know what's happening and why it's happening and where it's going. When you're reading for a religious obligation rather than just study, the story as it is. You have to read the book as the book was given. And so you have to fight that instinct and just read what's in front of you.
Like reading the Torah, you cannot.
It's exactly, and we're going to see. Well, it's not cutting corners. That's what I want to make sure. It's when you're studying. If we had a class on Megillah, we would probably jump around and I would say, look at this verse, see how it compares to this verse in chapter 9. We would do that kind of jumping in order to understand everything better. Because sometimes when you're reading it in order, you don't see the big picture around to compare. Like we did today in the Torah study class about the different dreams that people had. We had to jump around to look at all the different dreams and what kind of things they were telling us. But when you're fulfilling the mitzvah, right, it has to be step by step, because the mitzvah wasn't to just hear the story and understand it. The mitzvah was to have the book, or to hear the book read, to hear the book, not just the contents.
Is it by heart if he reads it in a translation, Targum, or in any other language, he has not fulfilled his obligation? And that was going to be my question, but you answered it.
Okay, well, so wait, what's your question?
If we fulfill the mitzvah by reading it in English, but
we're not done yet, and the answer is yes, kind of. So the best way to do it is, if you know Hebrew, is to read it in the Hebrew. And we're going to see it should be read from a klaf, the actual scroll, not a book, that was written correctly, and all the other stipulations, which is why reading on Purim is different than reading for other holidays or even for the Haftarah. But if you can't read Hebrew, that's what's going to happen next in our Mishnah. So we're not quite there yet. But the not reading by heart, again, this is the same reason why we don't read by heart from the Torah, which is when you're doing a mitzvah, you're doing it right. And I think it's right. You have to be sure. The only way to be sure is to read from the actual klaf. Part 3 is going to take care of people who don't know Hebrew.
But they may read it to those who do not understand Hebrew in a language other than Hebrew.
All right, so if people don't know Hebrew, actually know the story, you can read the story. Now, you can't just make it up, right? It's like, well, there was this woman, or Esther, and she kind of did this. You have to read the story. You have to read a translation, not just a kid's version. But you can read it to them in another language. Or, one more option.
One who doesn't understand Hebrew, who heard it in Assyrian Hebrew, has fulfilled his obligation.
Unlike other languages, Megillah read in Hebrew, even if you don't understand Hebrew, You have actually done the mitzvah.
And the story. You didn't learn the story.
You didn't learn the story, but you heard the Megillah read.
Oh, the mitzvah
Yeah,
is to hear
but
it.
the goal is not also that you learn the story.
Of Judaism is that you know the story and understand the story and know what it means. The goal of the mitzvah, hear the Megillah read. Right, so this is where we have to try and see, why are the rabbis drawing lines? Want this, but where's the minimum person has done their duty? And the done their duty is heard it read in Hebrew, heard it read in a language they actually understand. Now, if they heard it read in Hebrew and they didn't understand Hebrew, that's okay. But if they heard it read in Russian, then it doesn't count. Right? The translation reading only counts if it's the language you understand. Russia, and they're reading a Russian version of the Megillah, and you don't speak Russian, you're out of luck.
It says that you can read it in any other language. You have to read first the Hebrew and then
No, not obligation.
Not obligation.
It's good to read the Hebrew, of course, but if you don't understand Hebrew, you don't get to also read it in Russian instead. You have to read it in Hebrew. In Hebrew and only read Russian. Then the Russian version is okay.
But this doesn't specify that easy.
Well, it's Mishnah. Mishnah is always condensed. It's how it is. Is no one going to ask me about the Assyrian?
What is that about?
What is that about? It's for this font.
Yes, we talked about that.
Yeah.
It's like that's.
Yeah, we've mentioned this before, right?
Yeah,
That's not Hebrew. Well, I mean, that's what we call the Assyrian font. So when they say in Assyrian, they don't actually mean written in the Assyrian language. They mean written using the Assyrian characters for the Hebrew language. So it's just a different font that's being used.
Are the same. So you.
Yeah, nothing was changed. It's the only thing that was changed was the orthography. I love that word. Writing that was used. But none of the pronunciation was changed, none of the meaning was changed, none of the spelling was changed. It's just, as I think I mentioned before, it's like copying the text or selecting the text in Word. Right. Nothing got changed except everything went like that. That's all that's happening here. Italics, but still, if you've ever looked at the difference between like cursive and print in English language, but still be look very different, and that's what's happening here.
Do you know if we still have any Assyrian type scrolls or
All of our scrolls are Assyrian type.
All those, like in the Torah, this is Assyrian?
Yes.
Oh.
Our Torah is written in this font.
Assyrians.
Our Torah is written in this font. At least my Torah is.
I was confused. Said that there was a font like that,
Right.
and then we made it a little bit nicer. What was that?
Well, that's just my handwriting. in the Torah, it's a little bit more elaborate, right? The font is prettier, yes. The letters is the same, right? So they have crowns and other lines on them as decorative motifs, and you know they're significant, and there's a tradition we don't change which ones are done which. Pardon my writing, it's the same basic font, whereas the proto, archaic Paleo-Hebrew looks totally different. Right, it's scratches and lines and weird angles, and you, if I put it in front of you, would not recognize it as Hebrew. It wouldn't be like, oh, it's kind of an olive. Nothing.
I believe that you said that happened when we came from the
Exactly, the Babylonian return. Exactly. We adopted their script because it worked better. I don't mean worked better like it was more mystical or something. It worked better because you're right. And easier to then transmit more information. So, all right, Mishnah 2.
If one reads it with breaks or naps in between readings, he has fulfilled his obligation.
That's pretty straightforward, right? If you're reading and you're nodding off, or if you're reading and you have to take a break, your obligation. It's not the ideal way. You'll note that we don't usually try to do this. We want people to stay awake. Usually falling asleep during the Megillah reading is not our biggest problem. We do know that it is possible to take a break.
So that's why we have to fulfill the mitzvah with the tradition of a man.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, with the groggers and the noisemaker. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
Wake up, son.
You're just being very strict.
Yeah.
Yeah. Part 2.
If he was copying it, explaining it, or correcting a scroll of Esther, in his heart, he has fulfilled his obligation, has not fulfilled his obligation.
Okay, so it may sound a little far-fetched, but they're trying to make a point, which is, imagine you are copying a scroll of Esther, right? So you're using one scroll to make a new scroll. So you're looking over there and you're doing that back and forth. It is the day of Purim. Forget that it's Purim somehow, and you copy the scroll over, and that means you had to have read it in order to copy it. You did not do your obligation. You have to now read the scroll properly. Even if you were reading it out loud, often read the scroll out loud while they're copying it. Your obligation, because you were not listening to the scroll for the mitzvah. If I'm teaching the scroll of Esther and I go through the entire scroll, I don't miss a single word, and I wasn't actually thinking about the holiday of Purim, and I didn't do it. If I'm copying it and thinking, wow, this is so great, I'm copying the scroll of Esther and today's Purim, I'll read it while I'm copying it, even though I'm also copying at the same time.
We are coming back to the same idea, the kavanah.
Yes, exactly right. Right. So we have seen this this basic idea over and over in different circumstances, which is art. What is your intention? What is your kavanah? Sometimes it doesn't. Right. Sometimes zero kavanah is still okay. This is where there's a question of what did you mean while you were doing the action? Very, very important. And this is one of those places, among many, where what you intend, even if the action is otherwise indistinguishable, right? I can't tell the difference between somebody who's thinking about Purim while copying the scroll and someone who's not thinking about Purim copying the scroll. Can't tell the difference. And God can tell the difference. And that makes a difference.
The last class, okay, you say that it's not important, it's more important your deed than what you think,
yes.
Thoughts. Now going against that.
Yes and no. I love that answer. So, yeah, well, because it's true, right? It's never that simple. The deed needs thought, then there must be thought. If the deed doesn't need thought, then the deed can be performed without thought. So, like, let's say, for example, giving money to tzedakah. Tzedakah without really thinking about it. It's just your habit. You come home, you take your wallet, all your loose change, you put in the little pushka, and that's just what you do when you come home. As I put my keys over here, I put my change in the pushka. You still gave to tzedakah. You still were doing the mitzvah of tzedakah. On the other hand, reading or hearing the scroll of Esther, about having sound waves bouncing off your head, you have to believe that you are doing the mitzvah of Esther. Down as small as hearing it in a language you don't understand, like Hebrew for many people. Believe you're there for the purpose of the mitzvah. Because if you're not, then it's just going by. Another example of this is the sounding of the shofar. Past the synagogue, says the Mishnah, and they blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Ah, it's the shofar because it's Rosh Hashanah. Done your duty. You have done the mitzvah. On the other hand, if you're walking past the synagogue, they blow the shofar, and you're like, what's that noise? Oh! And you didn't do your duty, right? You're not, let's say, you have to now still find some other way to hear the shofar. You haven't done the mitzvah yet. So if the deed can be done as just a deed, intention is not essential. It's always desired. We always want people to think about what they're doing. But if the deed needs intention, or else it's not a deed, taken as something else, then intention is essential. So it's never easy to say is needed or kavanah is never needed. Depend upon what the mitzvah is. All right, and then part 3.
In arsenic, with red chalk, with gum, copper.
All right, these are different ways of making ink.
Okay. Or on paper, or on scratch paper. He
Right.
has
Remember,
not-
we don't write our scrolls on paper. Like this, not papyrus, we have to use a cloth or a hide from an animal for the scroll.
He has not fulfilled his obligation unless it is written in Assyrian on parchment in ink.
Why only in parchment?
But, well, the cloth,
Why only in cloth and not in paper?
that it had to be written in the same way as a Torah scroll was written. That it was written specifically for the purpose rather than just a practice copy. Okay, good. We're doing well on time. Mishnah 3.
A town who has gone to a walled city, or a resident of a walled city who has gone, if he is to return to his own place, he reads according to the rule of his own place, and if not, reads with them.
Okay, so this is another great example of intention, ability. So maybe a little picture will help here.
We learned that also.
Well, we
The
learned.
same idea in. When was the Mishnah that we got the same that like the original one, the original town in praying? No.
I know what you're talking about. I don't remember exactly what it was.
Well,
but
let's work on this one, right? So we have the walled town. That's a big walled town. And you have a little village, right? No walls. Now, Mr. Shapiro is visiting the walled town for the day, and it's the night of Purim. Mr. Shapiro goes to the town in the evening, and the walled town, of course, is supposed to read tomorrow. Right? Because remember, the walled town is on the 15th, and the village is on the 14th.
That's right.
That's the difference. So Mr. Shapiro was there on the evening of the 15th. The sun goes down, the stars come out. Should he take out his pocket edition of the Megillah? That's what he would do if he were home.
Yeah.
Or should he stay here and read together tomorrow with the people? The question becomes, the Talmud gives us an answer, because what we're saying here is, if you're going to return, then you read. If you don't return, you don't. The Talmud gives the answer that if you're coming back by morning,
Before the 15th.
if you're there on the evening of the 14th and you're going to be back during the daytime of the 14th, the evening of the 15th, you should read your Megillah. Read the Megillah again in the morning. You celebrate Purim in your hometown with everybody else there in the morning. Not going to be back in time for the 15th or for the 14th, then you need to celebrate with the 15th and the people in the town. Going home, and you're not able to therefore celebrate with your home, to read early, you just wait, as you're already planning to do, and read together with the people of the walled town.
Yeah.
Right? So, and it's based.
But why he need to read the 39th?
Now, this is the evening of the 14th.
Not 14. Okay.
Right. So they read on the 15th, but he's there on the evening of the 14th. He would if he were home, or if he was in the middle of the wilderness, or does he read, or does he wait and say, well, they're going to read tomorrow, so I shouldn't read differently than them. If you're going to be there tomorrow, you should read with them, which means don't read tonight on the 14th. Them tomorrow, and you're going to be home, read tonight on the 14th, and then when you're home tomorrow, do the rest with your community too.
It's a little confusing because I know that if the 14th and he's in that town,
right?
Already the 15th, the 15th day of Adar.
No. I'm using only the Hebrew calendar here, which means the 14th means that's the evening of the 14th. That's the start of the 14th.
Okay. So he's there.
Yeah. Yeah. I know it's you gotta change your mind completely over to the Hebrew calendar and say the night of the 14th is the beginning, not the end. Yeah.
So the night he was that place, so you have these choices. Yeah.
Well, he doesn't have a choice. If he's going to go home, then he should read now. If he's not going home before they get to theirs, then you wait for them to catch up and you read with them.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it's not such a big deal because we can drive. You know, if you're in Jerusalem for the evening of the 14th, but you're going to be home outside of Jerusalem, then of course you wait and you read when you're home. There's a longer travel time. You know, you had to figure out, what am I doing?
But could be that today they have walls,
No,
or that they had in the past.
it had to be a wall, the city that was walled in the days of Yehoshua.
Yeah.
Which pretty much means Jerusalem. So
Because he was the only one walled.
well, it's the only one that we likely to have been walled at that time. So that's
So you're safe in any other place.
right. I mean, so if you go to Canterbury, which has a city wall or something like that, then you don't have to worry. It's not a walled city. You're reading on the 14th. The days of Yehoshua, the people of Canterbury were living in mud huts. So no offense to Canterbury. It's a lovely town now. Highly recommend visiting there. I had a very nice trip there when I was in college, but it was no amazing place. The last 3,000 years really fixed it up. All right, part 2.
And read the Megillah and thereby fulfilled his obligation.
So this is one of those great questions that just show you really trying to be careful interpreting what's going on. So the question is, you have to read. Where do you start? Now we would think automatically chapter 1, verse 1. Right? It agrees.
Oh. Okay. So Rabbi Meir says all of it.
Chapter 1, verse 1, right?
Rabbi Judah says from there was a Jew.
Which is chapter 2, verse 5, which is when the story gets going. View. Right? Because everything before that is all about Achashverosh and Vashti. There's not a Jew in sight. Reading about their parties. Now, we know now, because of many arguments and long discussions and commentary since then, that everything that was happening in the first chapter is essential for everything that happens later. You know, it was a reasonable question. Why should I read about their parties for my holiday? A different opinion. He said, chapter 2, verse 5, that's when we enter the story. That's when we should start talking. It's a different explanation.
And Rabbi Yossi says from the after these things.
Which is chapter 3, verse 1. And that, Haman. Now, why would Rabbi Yossi say that's when we should start reading? Because everything before that doesn't matter if Haman isn't doing what Haman does. The miracle of Purim comes because of our response to Haman's scheme. If there was no Haman, there would be no story. In fact, if there was no Haman, it would just be another depressing story forced into service of Persian kings, live, under their rule. And this poor Jewish woman who was taken captive and abused by this despot. And all of a sudden, this becomes a life or death struggle. The miracle of Purim's salvation is revealed. You need a villain to have a hero. So the story gets going with Haman, rather than the story gets going with us. Interesting literary twist that he gives of how do you read a story. No one cares about the story until there's conflict. literary theory, every story has to have a conflict. What's the conflict? If there's no conflict, there's no story. It's just a diary. Because he has a good reason for suggesting that. But yes, there we read all of it. Okay, good.
I'm surprised, Rabbi, Rashi didn't even comment. Didn't show any comment on Rashi.
Oh no, Rashi commented on all of this in his commentary on the Talmud. Yes, yeah. No, but
I was curious to see what he would have said.
Learn Rashi, and
There,
there's always more to there's always more to learn. Always additional commentary. Not only Rashi, but the nice thing about the United Synagogue translation that we use is many of the comments he makes and other scholars, and then put into easier English for the average reader. All right, Mishnah 4.
To read the Megillah, except a deaf person, minor.
All right, so qualified to read the Megillah, we don't mean they can sit and read the Megillah to themselves. We're talking about the public reading, right? So these people.
No, but the Torah you can read it for a minor. I had in New Jersey no Aliyah
Right.
reading the Torah.
Just
Right.
The daughter of my rabbi knew how to read perfectly Torah, and since she was 11, 10, she was reading Torah.
So did my daughter.
So
Yes.
it's possible.
Yes and no.
Yes.
If
Okay.
you are the children of a rabbi, yes.
No. So children were disqualified from reading the Torah after they had been qualified. That is to say, everybody agrees that women and children can read from the Torah, but they were disqualified for the kavod of the community, of the tzibur, for the honor of the community. And most of the commentators say that that's because the men of the community felt ashamed that a child or a woman could read and they couldn't. Keep down the embarrassment, we stopped letting women and children read. Stopped letting, not we just said, it's causing people to look bad. Well, myself included, we're a rabbi in New Jersey clearly as well, and many others as well, and we say, but so can minors if they know what they're actually saying, if they know what they're doing, and if they take their responsibility seriously. And as we're going to see, that's an issue here as well. But the idea is, in general, read to fulfill a mitzvah unless they are also obligated to the mitzvah. It's sort of the idea, but here in the reading, the mitzvah is the hearing. The mitzvah isn't actually the reading. And we generally consider that everybody's obligated to hear the Purim, the Megillah reading, which is why even in Orthodox settings, women still go to hear the Megillah. Right? They need to hear the Megillah. It's a mitzvah for them as well. Therefore, having women read the Megillah makes perfect sense. Now, again, in other communities, they stopped letting women read because it embarrassed them if they couldn't read. We don't feel embarrassed by the fact that there are knowledgeable women and knowledgeable children who are able to do it before bar and bat mitzvah, are happy and proud of anybody who can participate in this action. The deaf, what about them? Before, because these categories keep coming up. So remember the deaf and the idiot probably means better mute, as somebody who couldn't speak. What we are familiar with in the modern world of deafs and mutes, able to learn from a very young age how to communicate and therefore how to interact. We were talking about people before modern techniques, before Helen Keller and all of those amazing advances, and mental development was truly stunted. We know very well from research and from studies of people who are deaf and mute that if you do not learn any language, at least sign language, if not verbal language, like a very young age, your mental abilities will be permanently. The human mind needs language in order to develop. Out of language because of disability in this case, and because of lack of skills to give them a language that they could use, child will grow up permanently mentally damaged. And it's just such a shame that this went on for thousands and thousands of years until we've learned now and help them live beautiful and wonderful lives. So in the ancient world, a deaf person or a mute, or somebody who had been damaged but now can speak, because otherwise you can't read the Megillah for other people if you're a mute, because basically they were insane. Not insane like running around with a knife, but insane in the sense of not fully aware and conscious of everything going on around them. We might use the term simpleton, just in terms of, you know, a nice quiet person who's not very bright, but somebody really who doesn't even have the mental capacity of a child. That is the case that the Mishnah is talking about. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. But Rabbi Yehuda,
Rabbi Yehuda qualifies a minor.
right, so he sees that a minor is capable of understanding what they are doing, and therefore they are capable of reading properly, and therefore he allows them to read.
Not read the Megillah, nor circumcise, nor go to a mikvah, nor sprinkling purificatory waters. And similarly, a woman keeping day for day should not take a ritual bath until the sun has risen.
All right, we had to wait all the way to the end of that sentence to get to the point. The sun has risen. We're talking the sun breaching the horizon. Happens? All of the other things in that list? The question is if you did them earlier than that, and I know, who's going to get up before dawn? But people used to, because dawn was their alarm clock. Actually, people got up before dawn usually. And it's still dark out. Right? Let's say I'm up at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's still dark out, but it's the next day. I just woke up. Can I light a lamp and read the Megillah and for the daytime reading of the Megillah?
No.
And no. It has to be sunrise before you can do that. Brit Milah, before you can do a circumcision, or before you can go to a mikveh, or before you can sprinkle the purification waters, or you will let a woman go bath because of being at Zavah, the discharge in the non-menstrual cycle. All of those things done to be breaking the horizon. But
If any of these things is done after dawn, it is valid.
right, so dawn here means Amud HaShachar in the Hebrew, in my opinion, than the English, right? Because if you've ever been up at this time of day, and this time of year is when it's possible, before the sun comes up over the horizon, the sky already begins to lighten, right? It's already brightening out there. That's Amud HaShachar, right? That's the brightening of the sky. So it should be until the sun hits the horizon. But if you did it a little early, maybe you were mistaken, maybe it looked so bright outside, you thought it was time, but then you go out afterwards and you see the sun isn't really up yet. If you did it by accident, just a little bit earlier than necessary, but it was still dawn, right? The light was still there in the eastern sky. You still get credit, if you will.
What we can do during the night?
So there are proof texts for all of these of why they need to be in the day, but I'm not going to go through all of them right now. But if you look up a good commentary, this one is a bit abbreviated, but if you look up a good commentary, I think they also point out maybe, but if you look up a good commentary, they will have why each one is during the day. Actually, the one you have there should have it. And that's going to be even more important. Mishnah 5. Preface. Because we just talked about dawn and the sunrise, we now also need to talk about things that can happen time period. And by daytime, we mean the daylight hours. So what other things can you do? That's why we've got a list of 21 things in that category. Got it?
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Brief explanation, the citations are at the bottom as well.
The whole day is a valid time for, number one, reading the Megillah.
So if you wanted to read the Megillah at 2 in the afternoon, and that was the only time you could read it, that's okay. For whatever reason. Anytime. Now, we like to read it right around the same time we're doing the Torah service, in the morning service. You can't read it. You can only read it at the time. You're still okay. You don't have to read it at that time.
Sorry.
It's okay.
What happens if you know Hebrew but still you prefer to read the Megillah in English?
But it depends what you mean by know Hebrew. If you mean by know Hebrew in the sense that you can phonetically read Hebrew, but you don't understand the meaning, English is okay. But if you really understand Hebrew,
Comfortable and faster reading in English?
not about speed, right? If you understand it just as well, and that's going to be a personal choice, right? So if somebody's a first-year Hebrew student at university, you know, there's going to be certain phrases that they're not really comfortable with. Percent of it, then they can maybe make a decision to still read it in the translation. But if Israeli, if they speak Hebrew very well, if they can have a conversation in Hebrew and you know, be perfectly comfortable, why can't they read the Megillah in Hebrew? In general, if you can understand the Hebrew and you don't feel like you are missing, but you have a good, clear image, just like as if you're reading English or Spanish or Greek or Russian, the Hebrew, because the nuances of the Hebrew always give more information than any translation. It's the strong preference.
Number two, reciting Hallel.
So you'll know that we usually do Hallel right after Shacharit on a day when we read Hallel, in Hanukkah, but read Hallel technically at any time during the day.
But we recite Hallel in Pesach.
Yeah.
After the day.
When we recite Hallel in the evening, those are songs of praise that are part of the Haggadah, the mitzvah of Hallel. That's why we don't say the bracha for Hallel.
Okay.
We save the bracha for Hallel for the daytime Hallel.
Number three, for the blowing of the shofar.
Again, we have places where we put that right into the service on Rosh Hashanah. If we wanted to be creative, we could blow the shofar at the beginning of the service or at the very end of the service, or we could blow it in the afternoon. Or if you just sick in bed and you can't get to services and I'm like, oh, I can't do anything, but I can at least blow the shofar, that's okay. And all these things, by the way, are also pointing out that these mitzvot are floating. Although we bundle them into services for very good logistic reasons, technically they are their own mitzvah floating that we just have landed at this point in our customary service.
But still in Megillah, we blow the shofar and it's also a Mishach.
No bracha. Right? The blowing of the shofar at Megillah is not for the mitzvah of blowing the shofar. The mitzvah for blowing the shofar is only when we do Tekiyat shofar, the actual shofar service. We figure out where the mitzvah is happening, bracha. And that's kind of like, listen up, everyone, and not just because of music. In the shofar example. I don't know if we're going to finish all this tonight.
For taking up the lulav.
All right, so for waving the lulav during Sukkot, that should be clear and following the same pattern. Again, we know where we like to do it, but you could do it anytime. And with our religious school students or when people come by during Sukkot, we'll try to get them to wave the lulav at other times, the regular service order.
So without the blessing, you can do it any time, also night.
You can, yes. I mean, but you're not doing the mitzvah.
Yeah.
You're not like, if you blow the shofar at night to practice, lightning bolt to hit you. God doesn't do lightning bolts all that much. But you know what I mean.
Number five, for the Musaf's prayer.
Right, so technically, again, I could finish my sermon in the sanctuary and we could all go in and have Kiddush, and then we could say, okay, Kiddush is done, let's do Musaf. Fine. But getting people to come back into the sanctuary for Musaf, that's why we don't do it that way. we could do that. And there was actually, we often in rabbinic school in the on-campus sanctuary on Shabbat, we would do shacharit, and then we didn't have a rabbi on campus, So we would read Torah, and then we would do more study and discussion. And then when we felt like it, but we didn't do it straight on right after the Torah service like we do here. It was sort of when we were ready. And if we wanted to eat a little bit while we were doing our study, that's okay.
So why Orthodox all the time they keep watching and pushing the congregation to finish stuff or whatever?
Well, so you want to do Musaf with the minyan, and so you need people to be together to have a minyan. And you know also people will leave. And then you also want to make sure that you can do mincha. And so they try to keep the schedule tight. The individual rabbi or community. But yeah, that's the basics.
But you don't have a mincha dolanta, huh? Maybe that's why they push the time, so
Right.
you don't can do at any time because there are some preferences.
Right. And so that's preferences is the good word. The style that we like to do and the style that is preferred to do gives us a better the day. But the Mishnah is all about what is really the mitzvah, not about what is the preferred mitzvah. So we read other books. For the Mishnah, we read what is cut and dry, actually the mitzvah. Good.
Number 6 for Musaf sacrifices.
Right? The sacrifices in the temple for the Musaf offering on those days. We don't do it, don't worry about it.
And for confession over the oxen.
When you are about to give a confession over an ox in order for it to be sacrificed, you don't have to do that first thing in the morning. You don't have to do that at lunch. You just have to do that during the day.
Do that anymore.
No, without sacrifices, a lot of these are not relevant.
Number 8 for the confession over the tithe.
Same thing, when you bring in your tithes, the confession could be done at any time.
And when you're saying confession, is
Declaration is a better word.
a declaration.
Right.
Okay.
Usually that was a confession, usually as a sin. That wasn't a confession like I've sinned and that's why I'm bringing the tithes. It was the obligation of bringing the tithes.
Number 9 for the confession of sins on Yom HaKippurim.
Which we like to do all day as well, rather than just once. We actually do it multiple times.
Confession or nidre.
Yes, we do a confession for Mincha right before, and then we do confession during Mariv on Yom Kippur. Right, so I should point out, I was being a little joking. This confession is really talking about the Kohen Gadol and the Avodah service that we recite on Yom Kippur. So this is not actually our vidui, our confession. This was the Kohen Gadol, the high priest confession. Thank you for keeping me honest.
Number 10 for laying on of hands. And what does that mean?
Again, this is for before a sacrifice, that you need to put your hands on the animal to say, this animal is sacrificed. For ...
Number 11 for the slaughtering, the sacrifices.
Right, the actual animal.
Number 12 for waving them.
So some different opinions here, but the one that this translation is going with is the actual movement of the sacrifice that are being offered.
For the bringing.
Now, the alternative, by the way, is the waving of the omer, of the sheaves that were brought for the omer. 13?
13 for bringing near the vessel with the mincha offering to the altar.
All right, so getting the mincha offering up to the altar anytime. Now, again, the mincha offering was at a specific time. Or could be done at any time. Obviously before the actual mincha offering, but
Number 14 for taking a handful.
part of the offering.
Number 15 for placing it on the fire.
Again, another step.
For pinching off the head of a bird offering.
Even if the offering was going to be a bit later, the snipping off of the head could be done at any time. Literally just.
Number 17, for receiving the blood in a vessel.
When it was being brought out of the animal that had been sacrificed.
For sprinkling the blood on the altar.
Right, because there was always a sprinkling of the blood on the altar.
19, for making the sota drink.
The sota is the suspected adulteress. Book of Numbers, I think it's chapter 11, who has to drink the bitter waters in order to prove that she has not been faithless.
Number 20, for breaking the neck of a heifer.
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 Right, so the Egel Arufah is a when there's a body found in the middle of nowhere and you don't know who killed them, you measure to the nearest town, and then that town has to bring this cow, and you and say, we did not cause this murder, making atonement for the death of somebody in the wilderness.
Number 21, and for purifying the metzora.
So metzora is usually what's translated as leprosy, but of course it's not actually leprosy as we know it, but a spiritual affliction, an illness that shows up in the skin.
Any theological reason why all of those are in the day only?
All of them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. There's examples of, there's text for why each one is done when it's done. That's a whole nother list, which goes beyond tonight's class.